On the 25th of March, 1459, while church bells announced the resurrection of Christ, a prince prepared the greatest betrayal ever seen in Wallachia. Easter Sunday should have been a day of peace. In the courts of Europe, nobles celebrated with banquets, musicians played, children ran through the halls. But in the palace of Târgoviște, capital of Wallachia, something different. Vlad Drăculea, the son of the dragon, had occupied the throne for 3 years. 3 years of meticulous terror. 3 years rebuilding a kingdom that the nobility had destroyed. His father, Vlad Drăculea, had been buried alive by the boyars. His older brother, Mircea, impaled while still young, his eyes torn. The prince did every face, every family that holy morning, as the sun rose over the Carpathians, messengers rode throughout Wallachia. They carried invitations sealed with the red dragon. The voivode summoned his boyars to a banquet, not just any banquet, but the celebration of Easter at the royal palace. It was an honor, and no one refused invitations from Vlad Drăculea. The nobles began arriving at dusk. They came from the mountains, from the plains, from the borders, with old men bent by the weight of decades of intrigue, young men of 15, heirs to fortunes built on corpses, women adorned with jewels stolen from children who did not even know why their parents trembled when crossing the. Nearly 500 nobles filled the great hall. The tables groaned under the weight of food-roasted lamb, fresh bread, red wine that flowed like rivers. Musicians, servants ran back and forth. Everything seemed perfect. But those who knew the prince noticed the silence in him. Vlad observed, always observing, counting faces, marking names on a list that only he could see. The banquet lasted hours. The boyars ate, drank, laughed too loudly. They forgot for a moment that they were before the most dangerous man in Eastern Europe. They forgot that Vlad Drăculea never did anything without purpose, that every gesture had, that this invitation, this feast, all this generosity was the calm before the storm. When the last platter was removed and stomachs were heavy with food and wine, the prince stood up. The hall fell silent. Even the children stopped running. Vlad Drăculea raised a cup of wine and smiled. It was a smile that did not reach his eyes, a smile that some recognized as the last they. The prince walked slowly between the tables. His steps echoed in the deadly silence that guards appeared at the doors, not the common guards, but soldiers handpicked, men loyal only to Vlad, men who would not ask questions. The voivode stopped before the oldest boyar in the room, a man of almost 70 years whose hands trembled holding the cup. His name was Stanislav, and his family had served the Wallachian court for 4 generations. Vlad looked at him like a wolf observes Stanislav, his voice cutting through the air like, "How many princes have you served?" The old boyar swallowed hard. 7, my lord. I began in the 7 prince. 23 years, my lord. Vlad nodded slowly, perhaps 40 years old. And you, Dragos? How many princes? 5, sir. 5. The prince repeated the word as if he were savoring poison. 5 princes in 15 years. Interesting, very interesting. He continued walking, asking the same question to different nobles. Some answered with firm voices, others with frightened whispers. The answers varied between 3 and 9 princes, but all had something in common. None of those princes had died of old age. All had fallen through betrayal, murder, or civil war, and the boyars were always there, changing sides, surviving. Vlad returned to the center of the hall. 23 years, 7 princes. Do you under? No one answered. It means that each prince lasted on. My father lasted 7. My brother did not complete one. Vladislav, my predecessor, and now I am here in my. The silence. Tell me, continued the prince, his voice low but charged with. How is it possible that you, nobles of Wallachia, have served? Did you survive so many changes, so many wars? A boyar dared to speak. We serve Wallachia, sir. It does not matter who where. Vlad smiled again, that terrible smile. You serve well. When my brother Mircea was impaled and had his eyes torn out, you were also served. Should I feel honored to receive the same loyal service? The boyars began to shift uneasily. Some looked at the doors, but the guards blocked all exits. There was nowhere to. Vlad walked to a window and looked at the night falling over Targoviste. The full moon, one could hear in the distance the sound of celebrations, and common people celebrated what was happening, without knowing that history was being written in blood at that. Do you know why I saw? The prince's voice was now almost a whisper, but each word reached every corner of the. It was not to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. It was not to thank you for your loyalty. It was to ask something very. He turned suddenly, his eyes sweeping the crowd of. Who killed my father? Who delivered my brother to the torturers? Who conspired with Vladislav? No one answered. No one knows? How convenient. 500 nobles in this room, and no one saw anything. No one heard anything. Vlad clapped his hands once. Guards entered carrying rolls of parchment. I have here a list. Names of boyars present. When you hear your name, stand up. He began to read. The first name belonged to an old noble. The man stood up, trembling. The second name. Another boyar stood up. The third. The fourth. Vlad continued reading, his voice monotone, methodically destroying any hope in the. When he finished the first list, almost 100 men were standing. Then he took another parchment. This is the list of those present when my brother was tortured. Stand up. More nobles stood up. Some were already standing. Others now joined the condemned group. Children began to cry softly. Women embraced their husbands, knowing that something terrible was coming. A third parchment. And this list contains the names of those who swore loyalty to Vladislav after he killed my brother. Stand up. Now, more than half the hall was standing. The boyars looked at each other, searching for allies, for complicity, for anything that would save them. But there was no salvation. Vlad had planned this with surgical precision. The prince walked up to a young noble of no more than 6. You are the son of Boyar Machinik. Yes, sir. Your father betrayed 3 princes before me. He managed to flee before I could judge him. He is hiding somewhere in Transylvania, protected by the young man. But you are here, representing your family, carrying the name of a traitor. I did nothing, sir. I am only a son. Vlad completed the sentence. Only a son. And what do sons of traitors grow into? More traitors. Rot does not disappear on its own. It must be pulled out by the roots. The terror in the hall was palpable. Some boyars tried to argue, swear innocence, remember services rendered. But Vlad was relentless. For every excuse, he had an answer. For every documents, witnesses, intercepted. The prince had spent 3 years gathering proof. 3 years planning that. Do you want to know what Wallachia's biggest problem is? Vlad returned. It is not the Turks. It is not the Hungarians. It is not the Saxons. The problem is you. This parasitic nobility that lives by betraying and selling itself to the highest bidder. He pointed to a specific boyar. You, Grigore. Last year I received information that you secretly negotiated with Dan, the pretender that the Turks support. You told him you would help him take my throne in exchange for lands. Do you deny it? Grigor turned white. They were just conversations, sir. I never intended to betray. Then why did you accept the gold he sent you? Yes, I know about the gold. I know everything. Another noble, further back, tried to get up and run. The guards held him before he took. Vlad watched him be dragged back to his. I always knew you were the. Your father betrayed my grandfather. You betrayed my father. Were you planning to betray me too? Must the family tradition I have children. And my brother Mircea would also have. Vlad's voice was the voice of a judge. The children were crying openly. The men tried to appear brave, but the fear in their eyes betrayed them. Everyone knew they would not leave there the same way they entered. The question was, who would die? Vlad took a cup of wine from a nearby table and drank calmly. He let the silence prolong, let the fear grow. He was a master of psychological terror. He had learned from the Turks when he was their prisoner. He had perfected the art in 3 years as prince, and now he applied each lesson with deadly precision. You celebrated Easter, he finally said. You commemorated the resurrection of Christ, who died for humanity's sins. What a beautiful story. What deep devotion. But tell me, who will die for your sins? No one answered. Exactly, no one. Because you will have to die for your own sins. Vlad returned to his main seat and sat down slowly. He observed the 500 terrified faces before him. Some were crying. Others tried to maintain. A few still believed they could negotiate, bribe, escape. They did not know who they were dealing with. "I will give you a chance." The hall filled with a collective sigh of hope. A single chance. The boyars leaned forward, desperate to hear what would come. "Those who prove absolute loyalty to me will live. They will have their lands returned, their titles preserved, their families spared. But they need to do exactly what..." Without questioning, without hesitating. "Do you agree?" A chorus of desperate voices shouted, "Yes, sir, yes, whatever you order." Vlad smiled for the third time that night, and then, with a calm that froze the blood, he said, "Excellent. Then prepare yourselves to walk." "Walk, sir?" a boyar dared to ask. "Yes, walk. There is a fortress in the mountains, Poenari, an old castle almost in ruin. It is 30 miles from here, on a steep slope of the Argeș River. You will go there, all of you, and you will rebuild it." The nobles looked at each other. Rebuild a castle? That was peasant work, not for boyars. But if that was what the prince wanted, they would do it. Better to carry stones than... "When do we leave, sir?" someone asked. Vlad stood up again. His eyes shone with something that could be mad or both. "Now." "Now! But it is night, sir! And it is Easter Sunday, and our clothes..." "Exactly as you are, with those party clothes, with those silk and velvet garments, with those jewels and adornments. You will walk 30 miles through the mountains, and when you arrive, you will work until the castle is finished, or until you die, whichever comes first." The hall exploded in protests. Desperate voices shouted injustice, mercy, clemency. But the guards were already moving, pushing the nobles toward the doors. Children were torn from their mothers' arms. Old men who could barely stand were forced to move forward. There was no escape. Vlad observed everything from impassive, calculating. And as the first boyars were pushed into the cold night of the Carpathians, he thought of his father buried alive, of his impaled and blinded brother, of all the betrayed princes who came before him. The bloody Easter had only... and Wallachia would never be the same. The march began at dawn. 500 nobles dressed in their best Easter clothes, now transformed into prisoners, walked along the road leading to the mountains. The soft leather shoes made for dancing in marble halls tore on the sharp stone. The women's silk dresses, the children cried, their small feet bleeding before the sun had fully risen. Vlad did not accompany. He did not need to. He had detailed 50 mounted guards, brutal men chosen for their loyalty and cruelty. Anyone who stopped was whipped. Anyone who fell was trampled by those coming behind. The old suffered most, their fragile bodies unable to bear the steep climb. Some died in the first hours. Their bodies were left on the roadside. The road to Poenari was an old trail. It wound through dense forests. The Argeș River flowed below, its icy waters singing a song of death. With each mile, more nobles fell. A 60-year-old landowner had a heart attack on the first steep climb. A young mother fainted from exhaustion, her baby torn from her arms by a guard and given to another woman to carry. Meanwhile, in Târgoviște, Vlad received documents stolen from boyar houses, intercepted letters, testimonies from servants who had been mistreated by their masters and now sought revenge. The prince did not act on impulse. Every name on his lists had evidence. Every accusation was founded. One of his closest advisers, a man named McNally, who had served faithfully since the beginning of the reign, entered the audience chamber. "My lord, news has arrived from Transylvania. The Saxons are furious about what happened yesterday. They say you massacred the Wallachian nobility." Vlad did not take his eyes off the documents. "I killed no one. I just put them to work. They say it is slave labor, that nobles should not be treated like peasants. And why not?" The prince finally... "Why do nobles deserve? Because they were born and because they inherited nobility must be conquered through service to the kingdom, not through the spilled blood of princes. There are rumors that some of the nobles have connections with King Matthias of Hungary. He may not like this. Let him not like it. Matthias needs me as much as I need him. The Turks are pressing our borders. He cannot afford to lose Wallachia. The political situation in the Ottoman Empire was growing in power. Hungary needed buffer states like Wallachia to keep the Turks away, and he used this knowledge as a weapon. On the third day of the march, the nobles reached Poenari. What they saw filled them with despair. The castle was more than a ruin. It was a stone skeleton hanging on an impossible cliff. The towers had collapsed. The walls were cracked. The entire structure seemed about to fall into the abyss. A captain of the guards read the prince's orders aloud. "You will rebuild this castle stone by stone. You will work from sunrise to sunset. You will receive water and black bread once a day. There is no rest until the work is complete. Anyone who refuses will..." The boyars looked around desperately. There were not enough tools. There was not adequate food. There was no shelter again. And worse, there was another ruin nearby. Remains of it. The guards pointed to it. "You will use the stones from that castle to rebuild this one. Carry everything." Thus began one of the most brutal labors in medieval history. Men who had never held a pickaxe in their lives were forced to break stones. Women who spent days embroidering now carried heavy rocks on their backs. Children, some only 5 years old, were forced to fetch water from the river below and climb the slope carrying buckets. The silk and velvet Easter clothes transformed into rags within days. The shoes disintegrated completely, leaving bare and the nobles' hands, previously soft and cared for, became raw flesh, nails torn out, fingers broken under heavy stones, backs curved under the impossible weight. The old died first. Their bodies simply gave up, unable to bear the slave labor. Stanislav, the 70-year-old boyar who had served 7 princes, dropped dead at midday. His heart gave out as he tried to push an enormous stone uphill. His body was thrown into the precipice without ceremony. Then came the deaths from exhaustion. Men and women in their 40s and 50s, bodies no longer young, forced beyond their limits. A woman named Elena, wife of a boyar who had plotted against Vlad Drăculea, worked until her hands were unrecognized. On the 7th day, she simply stopped moving. She stood there, holding a stone, and died like that. Eyes open. Back in Târgoviște, documents continued arriving at Vlad's death. Modern historians have found many of these documents in Hungarian and Saxon archives. Letters from Transylvanian merchants describing the terror that befell the Wallachian nobility. Accounts from priests who visited Poenari and saw the nobles working. Death records, lists of... One document in particular, preserved in the archives of the city of Brașov, describes the vision of a Saxon merchant who passed near Poenari in April of 1450. He wrote, "I saw men and women dressed in rags that were once fine clothes. Their faces were unrecognizable, burned by the sun and disfigured by work. They did not look human. They looked like ghosts forced to build their own mausoleum." Another document, a letter from a Catholic priest sent to Rome, reports, "The Prince of Wallachia punished his nobility in a way never seen in Christendom. He treated them as the Egyptians treated the heathen. But while Moses freed his people, Vlad enslaved his. But there were those who supported the prince's actions. Michael Szilágyi, uncle of King Matthias and ally of Vlad, wrote in his memoirs that the Bloody Easter was a political necessity. He argued that the Wallachian nobility had 7 princes in 23 years, each one betrayed and killed by the same class that now paid. Modern historians still debate Vlad's motivation today. Some, like Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally from Boston University, argue that he was no worse than other rulers of his time, that his methods, though brutal, were understandable in the context of a violent and treacherous medieval Europe. Others, like Kurt Treptow, suggest that Vlad suffered from some type of psychological trauma. Years as a prisoner of the Turks, seeing his own father betrayed, his brother tortured, all of this would have created a man incapable of trusting anyone, a man who saw betrayal in it. But the documents agree on one point. Of the 500, very few survived. Estimates vary, but most historians believe that fewer than 50 emerged. Poenari Castle took 3 months to rebuild. 3 months of uninterrupted hell. The survivors worked until their clothes completely disappeared, leaving them naked under the scorching summer sun. Their bodies transformed into walking skeletons, sunken eyes, visible ribs, skin glued to bones. But slowly, Stone by stone, the castle re-emerged. The walls were raised, the towers rebuilt. A massive gate was in. Poenari became an impressive fortress, strategically positioned to control the Argeș Valley. It was a remarkable work of engineering, especially considering it was built by untrained people, using primitive tools and under inhuman conditions. Vlad visited the castle. He rode there in June when the work was halfway done. The guards bowed upon seeing him. The surviving nobles fell to their knees, some literally unable to stand. The prince walked among them in silence. He observed their destroyed faces, their mutilated hands, their broken bodies. He showed no emotion. He spoke no word. He just observed, like a general inspecting troops, like a farmer examining cattle. Then he turned to when the castle is finished, the survivors may return to their lands, those who still have lands. It was the only clemency, and even this clemency came with an implicit condition. They had been broken, humiliated, destroyed. Anyone who survived Poenari would never dare betray Vlad Drăculea again. A young noble, son of Boyar Machinik, the one whom Vlad had confronted at the banquet, approached, staggering. His 16 years had become 60 under the weight of the world. He whispered, his voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "Please, let us go. We have learned our lesson." Vlad stared at him for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, "You have learned. Good. Then when you return home, tell the other boyars what happens to those who betray Wallachia. Tell them there is no title, no lineage, no gold that can buy a traitor's life. And tell them I..." Young Massacre fell to his knees, tears streaming down. But they were not tears of gratitude. They were tears of a broken man, destroyed not only in body, but in soul. Vlad mounted his horse and left without looking back. He left the nobles working under the merciless sun, their groans echoing through the mountains. The prince had other matters to resolve. The construction of Poenari was only the beginning of his restructuring of Wallachia. In the following month, with the old nobility decimated, Vlad began loyal soldiers, honest merchants who had demonstrated. He created a new class of boyars, smaller and completely dependent on him. Men who knew that everything they had came from the prince and could be taken by the prince. The result was surprising. Wallachia, which had been a cauldron of betrayals and coups d'état, became strangely stable. The new nobles dared. The common people, who had always suffered at the hands of the old corrupt aristocracy, began to see Vlad not as August arrived. Poenari Castle. Of the nearly 500 people who had departed from Târgoviște that Easter night, only 43 returned alive. 43 walking skeletons, forever marked by the hell they had survived. But the story of the bloody Easter did not end there. It reverberated throughout Europe. In the following month, in Saxon, they were the first printed news in European history, and they had Vlad Drăculea as the main protagonist. One of these pamphlets, printed in Nuremberg in 1463, described the event with horror and fascination. The Prince of Wallachia, whom they called Drăculea, summoned all his nobility to a holy banquet, and when they were drunk on wine and confidence, he condemned them to slave labor. Old, young, women, and children, all forced to rebuild a castle in the... And when the work was finished, these pamphlets were not impartial. The Saxons of Transylvania had their own with Vlad. They exaggerated, dramatized, transformed facts into legends. But the essence of the bloody Easter changed Wallachia. In Rome, Pope Pius II received reports about the events. He wrote in his memoirs that Vlad was, though brutal. The Catholic Church needed strong rulers on the border with the Ottoman Empire. Better a Christian tyrant than a Muslim sultan. In Hungary, King Matthias Corvinus was divided. On one hand, Vlad had destroyed noble families that had Hungarian connections. On the other, he had stabilized Wallachia in a way that no prince. Matthias decided not to intervene. For now, Vlad was more useful alive than... But there was one place where the news of the bloody Easter was received with particular interest: Constantinople, capital of the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who had captured Constantinople only 6 years before, read the reports about Vlad with growing attention. He remembered the boy who had been the son of Drăculea. Kept as a Mehmed had... He had thought that the years as a prisoner would break him, make him submissive, but it seemed he had created a monster. The Sultan called his advisors. "This Vlad," he said, pointing to the documents scattered across his table. "He is dangerous, not just for his cruelty, but for his intelligence. He consolidated power in a way that no Wallachian, and now he controls a unified kingdom on our border." One of Mehmed smiled. "Let him think himself invincible. Let him believe he can defy the Ottoman Empire. And when he makes a mistake, when his arrogance takes him too far, then we will crush not just the prince." It was the beginning of a war that would transform Vlad Drăculea. A war that would be fought not just with armies, but with psychological terror of unimaginable proportions. But all of this was still to come. In that August of 1459, as the last survivors of Poenari staggered back to their destroyed homes, Vlad was in. He had proven he was different from. He had shown that he had established a precedent. The Bloody Easter was not just revenge, it was a declaration of principles. It was the birth of a new kingdom, forged in blood and terror. And if this story seems impossible, if it seems exaggerated, consider this. The documents are there, in the archives of Brașov, in the manuscripts of Nuremberg, in letters preserved in Hungarian libraries. The Bloody Easter happened. 500 nobles entered a banquet. Fewer than 50 left Poenari alive. History tried to bury this truth under centuries of legends about vampires and monsters. It tried to transform Vlad Drăculea into a gothic fantasy, into horror entertainment. But reality is more frightening than any fiction. Because the real Dracula, he simply understood that absolute power requires absolute terror. And he was willing to pay. In the next chapter of Lost Legends, we will dive into the Castle of the Condemned, where the survivors of the Bloody Easter discover that their ordeal is only beginning. Prepare to discover the architectural legacy built on human bones, because sometimes stone walls guard more than